Afternoon, everybody, and welcome. And I want to thank everybody for attending the Clean Air Talks. It's great to see a good representation in the audience, and I'm sure that there's people online as well. Um, I just want to welcome folks to this session of the Clean Air Leadership Talks, where we'll be honoring the 2022 winners of the California Air Resources Board's Haagen Clean Air Awards. The Haagen Clean Air Leadership Talks are a unique and exciting way to learn about real-world air pollution problems and innovative solutions from individuals who have earned California's premier air quality award for their contributions. Today, we're so pleased and grateful to have presentations from 6 of the award winners or their representative. After a brief overview of the Haagen Award Program, I will introduce each of the winners or their representative in turn before they present. We'll then conclude with a special thank you to our Haagen Advisory Committee members who advise the chair on the selection of each year's awardees. We'll be aiming to conclude no later than 3:30 p.m. So considered the Nobel Prize in Air Quality Achievement, the Haagen Clean Air Awards are named for CARB's first chairman, the late Dr. Ari Haagen, who is best known as the father of air pollution control, for linking the formation of smog in Southern California to automobile emissions in the 1940s and 50s. Dr. Haagen, a native of the Netherlands, was a leader in developing air quality standards based on his research efforts. He was a graduate of the University of Utrecht and a biochemistry professor at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena for 16 years before beginning his air pollution research in 1948. At Caltech, Dr. Haagen studied the physiological aspects of natural products, work that led to studies investigating the flavor components of such things as wine, onions, and garlic. This training and expertise in chemistry, along with just his natural curiosity, brought him to the forefront of air pollution research when he was asked by the County of Los Angeles to investigate the chemical nature of what we now call smog. Noticeably different from earlier accounts of haze and dust in London, which was caused by coal, the eye-irritating haze in Los Angeles was brown and almost odorless. Dr. Haagen applied his techniques of studying plant chemistry in enclosed clear chambers exposed to sunlight to figure out what caused smog in the Los Angeles air basin. Through a series of experiments, he concluded that most of California's smog resulted from photochemistry. So that's when substances in the exhaust from motor vehicles and the smokestacks of industrial facilities react with sunlight to create ozone. This breakthrough provided the scientific foundation for the development of both California and the nation's air pollution control programs. Dr. Haagen passed away in 1977, but his legacy lives on. Every year with the Haagen Clean Air Awards, CARB recognizes individuals who embody his legacy through their achievements in research, environmental policy, science and technology, public education, climate change science, international leadership, and community service, including environmental justice. Through distinguished careers, these awardees have made outstanding contributions to improving air quality. They have influenced important changes throughout the United States and the world, protecting public health and the air we breathe. In order to keep our schedule on track, after I introduce our in-person speakers, I will give them a 3-minute warning for when their talk is to end. The first 2022 Haagen Clean Air Awardee in the category of environmental justice is Ms. Peggy Shepard, the co-founder and executive director of West Harlem Environmental Action, or WE Act. She is a national leader in advancing environmental policy and the perspective of environmental justice in urban communities. She has been named co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, as well as the chair of the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and was the first female chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Ms. Shepard.
Good afternoon. I have the distinction of being an award winner of the Haagen Smit Award. And I thank the California Air Resources Board for appreciating the work that we all do to protect air quality in our communities here and around the nation. And I appreciate the acknowledgement of the environmental justice movement's effectiveness in raising the importance of air quality and its impact on the health of the nation. Now, we know that people of color are exposed to more pollution and that race is the primary factor. Our communities have been sacrifice zones for generations, burdened by the disproportionate siting of multiple sources of air pollution, such as from power plants, industrial facilities, bus depots, incinerators, highways, and sewage treatment facilities. In fact, We Act for Environmental Justice was born out of the siting of a sewage treatment plant in West Harlem. Now, in New York City, the North River Sewage Treatment Plant was originally supposed to be built further south in an affluent white neighborhood, but the residents there had the resources and connections to push back, forcing the city to relocate the plant. So it came to West Harlem, arguably the worst place in all of Manhattan to build a sewage treatment plant because it is one of the highest elevations in all of Manhattan. So it meant that they had to pump the sewage uphill to get into the plant. But they knew there wouldn't be organized resistance there. So they promised jobs. And of course, that's all too common with these kinds of facilities. And that's how we know that Cancer Alley began in Louisiana. They promised jobs, but none of the local folks ever got a job there. But what they did get was pollution and the adverse health impacts that it causes. Now, I was a Democratic district leader at the time, and I welcomed the jobs. But once the plant became operational, the stench from the open sewage tanks was unbearable, and the plant's smokestacks were in violation of the Clean Air Act. So we organized, we protested. We got arrested doing civil disobedience on Martin Luther King Day, holding up traffic on the West Side Highway. We filed a lawsuit, which the city settled for a $1.1 million environmental benefits fund. And from that settlement, We Act used funds to hire our first staff, since we had been a volunteer organization for 6 years. Now, our next amazing campaign, an 18-year campaign, was also focused on air pollution. And this was our Dump Dirty Diesel campaign. And it really sought to address the fact that at the time, 7 of the 8 bus depots in Manhattan were all located uptown in communities of color. Now, at the time, air pollution rates in some of our communities exceeded the proposed federal standards by as much as 200%. We had diesel buses idling in front of housing, schools, and parks. And we began to partner with the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health for the past 22 years to better understand what was happening in our community. And we needed to collect data. So in the face of mounting scientific evidence that linked diesel exhaust fumes to the exacerbation of asthma, heart disease, and premature death, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which we call the MTA, it operates the New York City's public buses, and they continued to purchase these deadly diesel buses and operated 1/3 of the largest bus fleet in the country in our uptown neighborhoods where we lived, worked, and played. And by doing so, they harmed the health of over 500,000 people, predominantly Black and Latino New Yorkers in uptown neighborhoods. So what did we do? We filed a Title VI complaint with the U.S. Department of Transportation. It was under the Bush administration. We charged the MTA with violating the civil rights of Northern Manhattan residents. We did not win, but we began meeting with the MTA each month to begin to raise our concerns and to begin to really ameliorate the issues. And so over an 18-year period of time, using the data that we gathered with our research partners, we forced the MTA through advertisements at bus shelters, through press conferences. We forced them to invest in diesel retrofits and hybrid buses. And now they're finally investing in all electric buses. But you know, our communities are not unique when it comes to the disproportionate siting of these kinds of facilities. It happens in communities of color all across the country and here in California. And that's why, following the lead of our friends in the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, we passed the second cumulative impacts law in the country last year. Now, this landmark environmental justice legislation ensures that the cumulative impacts of all sources of pollution are taken into consideration in the state's environmental permitting processes when potentially polluting facilities seek permits in disadvantaged communities. And the law becomes effective next year. But we know the fight is far from over. While we were able to successfully block the first 3 attempts to pass federal provisions that would undermine the National Environmental Policy Act called NEPA, Congress managed to slip it into the debt ceiling negotiations, getting it passed as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act earlier this month. Now, we know NEPA has been a bedrock of environmental protection. Not perfect, but still important. And it's been doing that since 1970. But as the co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, I will continue to voice our opposition to the weakening of NEPA and any further attempts to make it easier for polluters to target our communities. Now, our cumulative impacts law will provide some cover for New Yorkers, but communities of color across the country will continue to be targeted as sacrifice zones until we can get similar legislation in place throughout the nation. Now, let's step aside for a minute and talk indoor air pollution, which is far too often overlooked. Every time we step out the door, we face a deadly cocktail of toxic substances in our air, our water, our soil, and even in the products that we buy. But we spend around 90% of our time indoors. And certainly since COVID, some people spend even more. And so we know that in environmental justice communities, that means there's no respite from pollution, even in your own home. But our homes are far from healthy. And in low-income communities and communities of color and indigenous, housing stock is usually older, poorly maintained, and too many families are living in homes with pollutants such as toxic mold and lead. We know that living with mold can lead to a variety of respiratory issues, and in some cases makes people very ill. And in New York City's public housing system that houses over 600,000 people, the largest in North America, mold is a chronic issue. And there's a massive backlog in the remediation of it because public housing has been so underfunded ever since it became segregated. Now, New York State leads the nation in the number of homes, an estimated 5.3 million, built before it banned lead paint in 1978. And as a result of this prevalent threat of lead exposure, which in New York City comes primarily from chipped lead paint and construction dust, the state also leads the nation in the number of cases of children with elevated blood levels. Children of color are disproportionately impacted by lead poisoning, suffering lifelong health effects, including serious neurological and physical damage that can result in permanent learning difficulties. So what did we do? We passed legislation, New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004, that requires all landlords to inspect for lead and remediate if necessary whenever a tenant vacates an apartment. And that was nearly 20 years ago. Yet more than 2,500 New York City children are still testing positive every year for elevated blood levels as recently as last year. So a lack of inspectors, enforcement, in other words, a lack of political will to protect our children, to protect children of color, still remains the problem. We also know that indoor air pollution from appliances that burn fossil fuels is another major concern. And California has been leading the way in banning gas appliances such as stoves. Now, in January, we released the findings from our Out of Gas in with Justice pilot, which studied the impact on indoor air quality when transitioning from a gas stove to an electric induction stove. And we found a 35% reduction in nitrogen dioxide levels when we replaced gas stoves with induction stoves in public housing apartment buildings with Latino and African American tenants in the South Bronx. Now, in fact, nitrogen dioxide concentrations in homes with gas stoves exceeded the EPA's outdoor air quality standards. Now, just think about that. Using a gas stove can exceed EPA air quality standards for the outdoors, which already aren't strong enough. But in your own home, you have that impact. Now, not only is this a significant public health issue, given that we spend the bulk of our time indoors, but replacing fossil fuel appliances such as gas stoves, water heaters, and boilers is critical to meet our emissions reduction targets for carbon dioxide. Now, this is especially true in New York, where buildings burning fossil fuels produce 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions. That said, my organization, WEACT, was a leader in passing a gas ban in New York City to ensure that all new buildings built in the city will be all electric beginning next year. And I'm happy to report that New York State also put similar legislation into its 23-24 budget. So we should see no more buildings being built with fossil fuels statewide beginning in 2026. But we still need to figure out how to equitably decarbonize and electrify all of our existing buildings. If there are 5 million homes in New York State old enough to possibly have lead paint in them, think of the scale of the challenge we face in transitioning all of our existing homes and buildings throughout the nation from fossil fuels to all electric. That includes replacing gas stoves with induction, old boilers with heat pumps. This is going to be a challenge, especially in old buildings that may not be able to handle the electric load, which means there will be a challenge in low-income communities and communities of color to finance the electrical upgrades that were needed before these buildings can electrify. And of course, we've got to ensure that electricity comes from renewable sources. But we know this is going to happen because it has to. And we need to figure out how to do it and how to do it equitably. We all deserve healthy homes, healthy communities. And I'm proud to say that WEACT is helping to make that a reality for everyone. And just as all of the honorees here today are working for a healthier, sustainable environment for us all, we need to ensure that all of us, citizens, tenants, homeowners alike, are reaching this mission and adjusting our behavior and our policies to ensure a sustainable community and a sustainable earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's really relevant for a lot of the stuff that we're doing at CARB right now and moving forward with. I do want to ask for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If there are any questions now, we will also, if we have time, have some questions at the end. But if not, we will move forward. Alan, if you can come up to the podium.
Thank you very much, Peggy, for a very enlightened talk. And you rightly point out the health impacts from NO2. And I know California's been pushing the standard for NO2 for many, many years. And you made the comment that EPA standard is not sufficient to protect public health in the general community. What can we do, or what is being done to get more focus on NO2?
All of us in the policy world are constantly talking with EPA about tightening the standards. We certainly have enough science and data to show that that's necessary. I know right now the EPA is coming out with tighter standards for fossil fuel power plants. But again, we've got to keep the attention and the focus on environmental quality. There's a lot of work being done around climate change, but we've got to keep the focus on the regular environmental quality in our communities. And, you know, tightening the PM2.5 standards are going to be so important. And of course, we also know the EPA does not regulate indoor air quality. And that becomes a really important issue, as we know that our homes are so polluted from so many sources.
I'm also delighted to hear you emphasize the need to look at public health from criteria pollutants and toxics, as well as climate change. And I think the pendulum some ways has swung so far to climate, we forget that a lot of the environmental laws were based on public health, which is still a critical issue.
Thank you, Ms. Shepherd. We have to move on to the next speaker now. So I'm proud to introduce Dr. Alan Goldstein, who has been awarded a 2022 Haagen Clean Air Award in the category of Science and Technology. Dr. Goldstein is a professor and MacArthur Foundation Chair at the University of California, Berkeley. He began his career studying emissions from trees and was once described by the journal Nature as the man who smells forests. Initially interested in biogenic emissions, Alan has more recently broadened his scope of work to vehicular emissions, indoor air, and forest fire emissions. Throughout his career, he has advanced our understanding of the complex mixture of organic compounds in the atmosphere and related air quality issues such as ozone and particulate matter. Welcome, Dr. Goldstein. And I do want to also mention that staff will be holding up a sign with your 3-minute warning. And for folks in the audience, I want to mention that there are some pamphlets at the back of a program as well. So, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Goldstein.
Thank you very much. I'm quite honored to be receiving this award today from CARB. And I'm just going to be able to take the opportunity to share a few stories from my 30 years of research in our fields. Do I change my slides or you do it? What? Oh, next. So this award is named after Haagen Smit. And I think all of you know who Haagen Smit is. I just want to point out a few really key things that were so important to me. First of all, he had an amazing intellectual breakthrough where he understood that for the first time that the smog in LA was mainly coming from emissions from cars and industry, mainly related to combustion of fossil fuel, emitting hydrocarbons and NOx, and then that those chemicals reacting in the presence of sunlight to form these secondary compounds, ozone and particulate matter. Not only did he realize that and teach that to the world, he also made it his mission to do as much as he could to fix the problem. And he really dedicated himself for that, to that, and he became the first chairman of this organization, the California Air Resources Board. Well, I'd like to think that my own research has largely followed in his footsteps to continue understanding the chemistry of the emissions and their reactions to form air pollution, and specifically how we can control it. Next. So here in California, air pollution is actually the worst in the nation, but it's also a huge success story. Because if we look back to going back to the 1960s, we can see in the graph on the left that one of our criteria pollutants, ozone, has been coming down for years. And this is in the South Coast Air Basin. This is a beautiful paper by Dave Parrish, but it's using data from the California Air Resources Board. I want to point out that that very highest point for maximum 1 hour ozone was the year I was born, 1966. And since I was born, I've lived in this state pretty much my whole life, the ozone levels have been coming down. We started having regulations more focused on PM 2.5 and measuring PM 2.5 only about 20, 25 years ago. And you can see that those concentrations have also come way down. But a key feature here that's important is that PM 2.5 and ozone still remain above the state and federal air quality standards that we need to meet. And so there's more improvement that needs to be made. But over the last 10 to 15 years, the improvement has slowed pretty dramatically. And a lot of my research has been happening during that time. Haagen Smit focused largely on vehicle emissions and other industry emissions. And a lot of the early regulations were focused on how do you reduce emissions from vehicles. And you can see in the graph on the right that was published by Karsten Warnecke back in 2012, that a lot of the pollutants that are dominantly from gasoline-powered automobiles have been dropping for 50 years by 7.5% per year. That's astounding, really amazing. And one of the questions that we have to deal with now is, as the vehicle emissions have come down so much, and they're still coming down, but ozone and PM 2.5 aren't improving as fast, what else do we need to worry about? So next. Back in 2010, I helped lead a major CARB and NOAA and NSF funded project here in California called CalNex. And there are a lot of really important results that came from that. I just want to highlight one here that was led by one of my graduate students, Drew Gentner, now a professor at Yale. And what we realized in looking at all the detailed speciated organic emissions that were coming from gasoline-powered vehicles and diesel-powered vehicles is that a lot of the chemicals that were leading to secondary aerosol formation, organic aerosol in the atmosphere, were actually coming from diesel. And that diesel was contributing more than gasoline across all the major urban areas in the United States. And in fact, in Bakersfield, it was nearly 90% from diesel and only about 10% from gasoline cars. In LA, it was more like 70-30 split. And this was a surprise. And actually, it was pretty controversial at the time. But one of the key things that we also figured out at this time was that the vehicles themselves, the diesel and the gas emissions, still couldn't explain all the secondary organic aerosol that we were seeing in Los Angeles and the San Joaquin Valley. Next. So this is from a paper that was led by Brian McDonald, and he was formerly a graduate student at Berkeley, and I started working with him on this subject when he was a graduate student. And looking back, particularly at all that data from the CalNex 2010 study, realizing that the vehicles couldn't explain all the SOA, we came to the realization that volatile chemical products that were made from petroleum were actually responsible for about half of the emissions leading to secondary organic aerosol. And that has been a continued subject of research up until today, trying to figure out just how important are these VCPs. Next. So we're also looking at how important are other sources, like other kinds of urban emissions, wildfires, biogenic sources, and indoor sources. Next. Okay, completely separate topic here, but related to reductions in air pollution. Back about 8 years ago, looking at data on tule fog in the Central Valley, I had a very surprising insight. And that is that there were data on tule fog frequency going back to the very early 1900s. And tule fog is really thick fog that was forming in the Central Valley of California during the winter. It was known to cause massive losses in visibility and car accidents. And I grew up watching the nightly news in the winter, hearing about all the pileups that were happening in the Central Valley of California due to this tule fog. We barely hear about that today. Why? A lot of people have assumed that there's less tule fog because it's gotten warmer and it was due to climate change. But in fact, that's not the reason. What we figured out was that tule fog frequency and duration increased from about 1900 up to about 1970. by about 75%. And then it declined about 75% from 1980 to 2018. Why? Because air pollution emissions had exactly the same pattern. And in particular, the decline over the last 30 to 40 years is very closely associated with the NOx emission reductions. And NOx were the limiting ingredient to forming ammonium nitrate aerosol in the winter. And that ammonium nitrate aerosol was the seed that the fog particles were growing on, that the water was sticking to. And so this is another huge success story for air pollution reductions in California that isn't nearly as well known as the ozone and PM stories. But we really don't worry about tule fog anymore because we've cleaned up the air pollution. Next. So in June 2021, I led a field campaign that was also funded by CARB, where we flew in a Navy aircraft over the LA basin, and we measured the actual emission rates for NOx, VOCs, and greenhouse gases. And this is just a picture pointing to the fact that those VOCs and NOx are the key ingredients in making ozone and PM. And we wanted to understand for CARB and for our larger community, how well do emission inventories represent the actual emissions? Next. Nope, back one. There we go. So in the upper left, what you see is what the CARB inventory says the emissions are for volatile organic compounds, what the NOAA inventory says the emissions are, and what we measured. What you can see is averaged over the LA basin. There were 9 flights. The flight tracks are shown here in the upper right. What we see is that the emissions are actually higher than what's in the inventory. But there's only 2 classes of compounds that were really much higher in the measurements than in the inventory. First of all, the inventory was really good for all the vehicle-related emissions, which was nice, right? And that's something that CARB's been working on for a long time, reducing those emissions and also determining what they are. But it turns out that ethanol emissions, ethanol is my favorite molecule, by the way, and ethanol emissions are much, much higher than in the inventories, which was a surprise. Also, monoterpene emissions were much, much higher than the inventories. And those monoterpene emissions, we call them biogenic terpenoids, were particularly important because when they react in the atmosphere, they form secondary aerosol, secondary organic aerosol. And the lower left graph is an estimate of how much all those chemicals contribute to SOA formation. And what you can see is that the contribution from the terpenoids is really, really high. And that's in a report that just got accepted by CARB today. Okay, 3 more minutes. Next slide. Okay. Peggy started us thinking about indoor air. I was planning to talk about indoor air too. And this is from a paper that I published just a few years ago. There are just a few key aspects that I want to mention. We spend 90% of our time indoors. We worry about exposure to ozone and PM, but ozone PM levels indoors are very different from outdoors. Ozone is much lower indoors than outdoors because it comes in to the house and then it reacts away. We're actually exposed to more ozone oxidation products indoors than ozone itself. Particulate matter also gets reduced going from outdoors to indoors, except that we have a lot of additional sources of PM indoors. Specifically, cooking is a major source. And most importantly, for my research, the load of organic chemicals that are in the air indoors is vastly higher than outdoors, and most people don't know that. Next slide, please. So we did a series of studies indoors in residences in the San Francisco Bay Area. And what we're showing here is the total VOC concentrations in the bedroom, kitchen, attic, outdoors, and the crawl space in the basement. And on the left, you see the summer, on the right, you see the winter. The key thing I want you to realize here is this is a log-based graph, and the VOC levels indoors were literally an order of magnitude higher than outdoors all the time. And because they're higher all the time, that's mainly from continuous sources. But on top of that, you see these spikes when there are people in the house. Most of the spikes are actually due to cooking. And so cooking, next slide, cooking emissions have a really big contribution. Click again. So occupant activities are really important, but basically our exposure to volatile organic chemicals is way higher indoors. Next. Next. Okay, so let's talk about semi-volatile organic compounds for a moment. So this is just a chromatogram from a gas chromatograph of the mass spec. It's showing a range of compounds with lower volatility to the right, higher volatility to the left. And this is just a picture of all the organic chemicals that are in outdoor air that are semi-volatile, that start at about 12 carbon and go out to about 30 carbon. And most people would think that the outdoor levels are much higher than indoors, but let's look at what indoor looks like. Next slide, or next. Okay, so this is a picture of what a typical indoor environment looks like. There's vastly more of these semi-volatile organic compounds, and we're exposed to them. I've just labeled just one single one, diethyl phthalate, because it's of interest for human health. Gosh, maybe we should clean this indoor environment. What happens when we clean it? Next slide. What happens when we clean it is we start releasing all these semi-volatile organic compounds from surfaces, and they go into the air, and the conditions in the air get even worse. Very surprising. But you know, when you clean your house, you smell the cleaners, you smell all the chemicals for days afterwards. And that's what we're experiencing here when we look at this. Gosh, it makes me just want to go in the kitchen and cook, right? And what happens when you cook? Go ahead, next. Now we're adding the cooking emissions. The cooking emissions are all in red here. And over on the right side, those are more particle phase. So most of that is particulate matter. We labeled a couple of compounds. Cholesterol comes from cooking meat. Stearic acid comes from cooking with oil. And what we get from cooking is vastly higher concentrations of these semi-volatiles and particles indoors, where people are spending 90% of their time. And our exposure to those chemicals indoors is much, much higher than outdoors. Next slide. One of the things we're worried about today and going forward is the fact that wildfires have increased in frequency and magnitude, and the smoke from those wildfires is getting into our urban areas and exposing people. We're doing a lot of research on that in my group, actually funded by CARB to do that. On the right is a picture of the 2017 smoke from the fires that were in Napa that had reached Berkeley. That's the Campanile in the picture, center of the UC Berkeley campus. The PM 2.5 was about 150 micrograms per cubic meter in the air at that time. On the left is our chromatogram of the semi-volatile organic compounds in air in yellow during that wildfire experience in Berkeley, and in red from the cooking in the kitchen. And I think you hopefully can get the impression really quickly that what we're experiencing in terms of exposure to emissions from cooking can be even higher and is frequently higher than what we get exposed to in wildfire events when smoke is blowing into the area. So these are two topics that we're very concerned about going forward and want to keep working on. Next slide. And I just want to thank my research group. And this is a picture of our group last year. There were about 20 of us. That's as big as my research group has ever been, actually. And it's their work that I was representing today. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Gladstone. Are there any questions? We have time for maybe one or two short questions, or we'll have some at the end.
Susan.
Well, if nobody else would like to ask one, I'd be delighted to. The charts that you showed with cooking, I was curious whether those are with or without the fume hood in the kitchen. And the other question was, in the indoor one, you had like a basement value that was just systematically lower than the main floor. And that seemed odd to me. So could you explain that?
Sure, I can explain both those things. First of all, believe it or not, that figure from the kitchen was with the windows open and the ventilation on. Much better to have ventilation on and windows open whenever you're cooking. With the windows closed and ventilation off, the situation is far worse. So the next question was, why was the basement air so clean? One of the things that we learned during that study is we released tracers continuously in the basement, in the main part of the house, and up in the attic. And we followed the concentration of the tracers that we were emitting in each of those spaces. And one of the fundamental things that we learned is the airflow in the houses we were studying is from bottom up. So air enters into the basement from outside and then flows up through the house. So all the emissions that are happening in the main part of the residence basically never got down to the basement. And so the basement air looked a lot like outdoor air. And it was when you get into the living space where there are a lot more sources and a lot more accumulation of the emissions that are occurring indoors. And it was even worse up in the attic because it's flowing into the attic and then out.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And I think as we're at CARB updating our indoor air guidelines, it's very timely as well. So thank you very much. And I will move on to our next award winner. Our next award winner in the category of environmental justice is Dr. Shankar Prasad. For over 20 years of the second half of his career, he worked on community health and environmental justice at the South Coast Air Quality Management District, CARB, Cali, PA, and Coalition for Clean Air. He helped initiate CARB's environmental justice program and conceived the idea for SB 535, which directed investment funding to disadvantaged communities and utilized Cal EnviroScreen. He also played an integral part in the conversion of New Delhi's public transportation fleet from diesel to natural gas, which has influenced other Indian states to move in the same direction. Welcome, Dr. Prasad.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Shilling, for that nice introduction. In order to keep my talk within the allocated time, I've actually scripted my feelings. I'm humbled to sit before you all and join the renowned list of people who were honored before and those being honored today with the same recognition. It is definitely a privilege to achieve this in one's lifetime. I did not dream of this when I came to this country in 1984, nor when I worked for ARB. Next slide. I have had different jobs in my career. In fact, I took the job interview with Ms. Carolyn Stromberg, the head of the ambient air quality standards at that time at ARB, using a public phone, soaking in rain by the side of a roadway in the winter of 1987. I came to Sacramento in January 88 to take that job in the research division of this world famous institution. Next slide. I also worked in the nonprofit world and dealt with the perplexing functionality of the state legislature and governor's office. I learned a lot from these two spheres about how our lives get influenced or molded by these two entities with or without our knowledge on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. EJ or environmental justice was actually a taboo word in ARB in the late 90s. In spite of the internal resistance, lack of commitment from the executive staff, the program actually got initiated at the insistence of the chair at the time. It was named as Community Assessment Program and later called Neighborhood Assessment Program. I was told directly it will take a long nap, and a deputy even said at a SIPS public meeting that we are giving only lip service because of the chair. Obviously, we were not making much progress with the program after a year. At a chair staff meeting, my colleague Jerry Martin asked the chair, Dr. Lloyd, if not now, when? This triggered a visceral reaction and stronger push by the chair and some of the board members at the time. Thus, over the next 2 years of the persistence and struggle, we succeeded, and this board eventually adopted the first of its kind in the state, the EJ policies and actions. We don't just breathe air, we drink water, live around different land areas, eat food grown in different areas. They are all contaminated to a different degree, affecting us together, but the cleanup and the regulatory focus is not in a cumulative sense. Thus, we needed a paradigm shift towards a cumulative concept. Many of us also had recognized that health risk characterization done in the context of permitting process was not capturing the full spectrum of a person's exposure to multiple sources, pollutants, or the vulnerability of that individual, and also the characters of the community that one lives in. Hence, together with two of my staff, Steve Huey and Brent Takamoto, we came up with the concept of cumulative impacts, and that caught on widely. Together, we developed a hypothetical approach called pollution burden matrix to identify specific geographic areas having vulnerable people, multiple sources of pollution, taking into consideration the socioeconomic status also. This served as a conceptual framework for the environmental justice screening method and also the CalEnviro stream subsequently. And these areas were designated as the disadvantaged communities, first in AB 32, and subsequently they got better defined in SB 535. Also, the chair at the time had a vision for ARB to get involved at an international level. Being an Indian, I collaborated with the Center for Science and Environment and worked with Ms. Sanumita Rai Chowdhury, who is here in the audience. Thank you. To get the Delhi public transport fleet changed from diesel to natural gas. Next slide. While working in Cali, PA, I was aware of the battle that was fought around the language of AB 32 prior to its passing. The three phrases were the peace offering language that was agreed upon by the Enviro groups, very few EJ groups, and the governor's office and the authors at the last moment. Thus, cumulative impacts became official or got legalized. The third phrase was the needed hook for achieving environmental justice in California. It was critical to put a stake in the large scale of funds that would be generated by cap and trade. At the time, EJ groups were very upset and angry for being called at the last minute with the peace offering language and for including cap and trade in the AB 32. Next slide. I knew from day one that in order to bring about any shift, large scale of money is needed from a new source. A carve-out would not have served the purpose since the carve-out would be a minuscule of what is needed. In mid 2007, that's a year after the AB 32 was passed, Hewlett Foundation staff, Hal Harvey and Daniel Dean, had come to meet with Cali PA Secretary Linda Adams, who was still in a meeting. They were standing outside my office. I invited them to come in and sit down. The conversation obviously was about cap and trade and lack of support from the EJ groups moving forward. I suggested that a good chunk of funds generated could be placed in the community in something called a community benefits fund and used to bring about emission reductions or energy efficiency projects in the disadvantaged communities mentioned in AB 32 through a separate mandate. They liked the idea. I knew that this goal could not be achieved at the scale needed working from anyone inside the government. With the continuing conversations with Daniel, I offered to quit my job and work in a nonprofit group and advocate for the same, should they be willing to fund my position. The foundation agreed. I approached 3 different EJ organizations to hire me with the foundation funds, but was rejected because they felt that the optics would be viewed as endorsing the cap and trade. But most of the Enviro groups liked the idea, and I joined the Coalition for Clean Air as an executive fellow. My idea of the community benefits fund concept got written as AB 1405. And I really suggest those interested in history and specifics to read that part of the bill, which was so detailed. After the bill was introduced during the early advocacy process, Tim and I were invited to a LA Union station for a meeting with the EJ groups. We were chastised for sponsoring that bill and were even told that Coalition for Clean Air had no right to talk about environmental justice. However, most of them after 2 years signed on their support to the next version of the bill. There was one person in that meeting who knew what we were trying and also had some empathy and was courteous and said, "I'm sorry you had to go through this." And the person rightly deserves and sits on this board today. Thank you, Mr. Korean. Those were very thoughtful and wound healing words that have stayed with me forever. The 4 groups listed at the bar in the last bullet are the strongest supporter of the bill AB 1405 and SB 535 from day one, and for the reason listed, AB 1405 actually got vetoed. CaliPA was in support, but not ARB at that time. Following year, the bill got reintroduced as Senate Bill 535. Our advocacy efforts continued. All Enviro groups signed on, and many legislators recognized this opportunity as an investment cause, bringing investments in their districts and supported the bill. Recognizing the reality of investments in their communities, some EJ groups opted to support the bill. However, the more joined during the second year. At the end of the day, ARB gave its nod, knowing it would pass and will be signed, but also touted it as a climate justice vehicle at Peru. To date, that mandate has led to billions of dollars invested in disadvantaged communities. For me, the vision of cumulative impacts and communities receiving the scale of funds needed became a reality with SB 535. Next slide. Typically, I do this slide first, work backwards, but not this time. In my own view, these are the realities to bring about a change. I could never learn the art of the third bullet, and I also paid a price. Worked for 12 hours, 14 hours a day. Lost time with family and friends. Lost a good chunk of retirement. Lost a few good friends in the process. Don't know why, but I sleep without regret, and I'm proud to give my best efforts and soul to SB 535. Next slide. The success of SB 535 would not have happened without the education or support from this list of people, besides the backbone support of my wife Usha and our son Tejas. There were hundreds more who supported, but I am eternally grateful to all these individuals. Hope my path will cross once in my lifetime again to meet these. There's one more slide. Hope my path will cross once in my lifetime to meet these folks, reminiscing our old days. Thanks for your time and this honor. I'll cherish this as long as I live. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? I see.
Sorry, I was hoping someone else would come up. I don't want to dominate here, this side of the microphone. Wanted to add a couple of things to what Shankar said to add some flavor to his excellent comments there. This is the resolution that we passed to the board in December the 13th, 2001. It was made onto a little card so that board members and the chair could not forget. So these were the policies. I won't read them out. It'll exceed my 2 minutes. At the back, EJ deliverables. Now, maybe you want to look at where we are now on those. But the other two pieces, I want to back up two moments where became very emotional for me as well. When Jerry Martin, who was our press secretary, who was African-American and who had lived through some of the years with administration, which may be not as friendly to the environment. And when Governor Davis got in, as Shankar said, he said to me, as Shankar said, if not now, when? Another one was going down to LA and see the impact of communities from goods movement. And we visited the city of Huntington Park, not Huntington Beach. And the mayor at that time, she took me for a helicopter ride so we could see in perspective where Huntington Park was and the community around there in relation to all the truck traffic coming from the port of LA and Long Beach. So we went up in the helicopter, flew at the port of LA, port of Long Beach. And during that flight, she also said to me, Dr. Lloyd, you know I'm a Republican. Which of course meant nothing at that time because she was caring about her constituents and caring about those people. She subsequently became head of the Treasury. And when I served with her in the Governor Schwarzenegger administration, she was secretary as well. And she pointed out that her name was on all the notes. And lastly, I would just like to echo the fact is, as you know, you cannot get anything passed as chair of the board without the support of the board members. So we had some wonderful board members at that time, several of whom are not here, but I think also that they played a significant role in helping out in that place. So thank you.
I just want to acknowledge and thank some of my friends and the family members who are in the audience, and I really appreciate it for your coming to this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prasad. So now we're going to move to our fourth award winner, and that is Mr. Bill McGavern, who is Policy Director for the Coalition for Clean Air, and his award is in the category of policy. Mr. McGavern is also a former director of Sierra Club, California, and helped found the Green California network of organizations supporting clean air and climate protection. He has been instrumental in the early development of diesel-related legislation, such as the recently passed smog check for big rigs and transportation equity projects such as Clean Cars for All. He has also, throughout his career, forged successful collaborations with environmental justice advocates. Welcome, Mr. McGavern.
Thanks very much. So I'm hoping to convey some of what I've learned over the last 35 years of policy advocacy. And, when you say 35 years, that is a long time. And I'm not done yet. I've always thought of myself as being in this for the long run. And some of our accomplishments really do take time. Shankar had a great idea and persisted over many years until it became reality. And unlike Shankar, I didn't have an original idea, but I think that both of us will tell you that it's important for policy advocates to show up at every stage in the policy process and to persist. You have to persist through legislation and regulation and implementation. And sometimes there are good ideas out there that just haven't been executed. So I was outraged by the fact that our big heavy duty diesel trucks, which pollute far more than our cars, as Alan has demonstrated, were not subject to the kind of basic inspection that our cars are. So I suggested to Senator Connie Leyva that she introduce a bill on that. She did. The first year, we didn't get very far, but she's an excellent negotiator, was able to get Governor Brown on in support. She introduced it again a second year, and this time we were stymied by a chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee who really didn't care at all about air quality. Nevertheless, she persisted. And in the third year, introduced it again. We still had that unfriendly chair. We kind of had to do some zigging and zagging to get around, and eventually got it to the governor's desk. And at one point, actually, Governor Newsom met with a broad range of environmentalists, and Will Barrett from the Lung Association and I explained to him that there was no smog check for heavy duty trucks. He clearly didn't believe us. He turned to his Cali PA secretary. Secretary nodded, yeah, it's true. So when that bill reached his desk, he signed it right away. But that wasn't the end of the process, because the bill told CARB to implement it through regulations. So we saw that through the rulemaking process, working with the excellent staff here. That was adopted. Now this year, it's actually in effect and is projected to save over 7,000 lives and reduce more pollution than anything the state has done in many, many years. Persistence also means that even after we get a policy in place, we have to be vigilant, because the polluters keep attacking. All environmental victories are temporary. It's only our losses that are permanent. Advocacy is a team sport, so it always helps to bring allies. There was a former senior CARB staffer who said there are a lot of coalitions and bills in all of them. And no one can be everywhere, but I've always found it helpful to maintain that illusion. The challenge of working in coalitions is that as environmentalists, we're notoriously bad at prioritizing. There's so many problems, we have so many solutions, and picking priorities is difficult. In 2005, a lot of our bills failed on the assembly floor, and a freshman assembly member named Hector De La Torre called a meeting of environmental leaders, and he said, I get so many letters from you about so many bills, I don't know what your priorities are. You need to give me priorities. And that led to the formation of a network called Green California, the groups in the state that are working on environmental legislation. And we still work together. And we were able to get those priorities to Hector. He then worked to get them out of the assembly, even though the bills didn't have his name on them. Next slide, please. In prioritizing, I like to look at what's feasible and what's winnable. Actually, you can go to the next one. And by feasible, I mean is something that can actually be done in the real world that we live in. And winnable, it has to be something that has at least a credible chance of passing. But we don't want to be trapped by the conventional wisdom and only try to work on something that is already kind of accepted. We need to sometimes redefine what's possible. And, you know, when Fran Pavley first introduced her Clean Cars bill, there were a lot of skeptics. Even the people working on this for environmental groups in Washington, D.C. said, no, don't do it. You'll screw up our national strategy, which they really didn't have one because George W. Bush was president. Nevertheless, she persisted, got that enacted into law. It was then implemented by this board. And then eventually, once Bush was out of office, the federal government not only gave us the waiver to allow it go into effect, but made it national. It became the national strategy, and California standards went nationwide. It's important in advocacy also to know your audience. I mentioned that I took a truck bill to Senator Leyva. She represented a district that was plagued by truck pollution and the diesel exhaust that was afflicting particularly the low-income communities of color in her district and around the state. And you know, we often, when we're addressing decision makers, we only have 2 or 3 minutes, so it's really important to target the arguments that they're going to care about the most. I think it's important to bring our passion with us to work. Often the most compelling testimony comes from personal experience and stories about the impacts of policies on real people. And I also think it's important to have that discourse be civil. You know, to keep our democracy going, and it's endangered right now, in my opinion, we actually need to be able to talk to each other in forums like this in a civil way. Next slide, please. I think that regulators and advocates can work together. I really treasure my relationship with the California Air Resources Board. I think it's important that we each know our roles. They're different roles. We have similar goals, but different jobs. I don't work for the governor. Our job is to work for the breathers, especially those that have been the most ignored. And that is most often those in the environmental justice communities. So we'll push for what's best for the air and climate and public health. as advocates, I don't think we should see ourselves as the people who are making the deals, putting a finger to the wind to see which way it's blowing. It's our job to make that wind blow. Good regulators understand that we will push them and that we'll not always applaud them. And advocates should understand that the agencies, part of their job is to listen to the other side. And we won't win every time, even though we'll try. But what's important to me is that the regulators follow the facts and the law. And when they do, I think that big disparity in resources between the polluters and the breathers can be overcome. I remember one workshop, as is often the case, there were probably 20 industry representatives there. And on the public interest side, it was just me and Will Barrett from the Lung Association. I said to Will, well, there's 20 of them and 2 of us, so I think it's a fair fight. And I didn't just say that out of bravado, but because of the fact that if you're in an agency that is following the science and respecting the law, then I think that playing field is actually level for us. I also think it's important for the regulators and the advocates to keep the lines of communication open, that even when we disagree, we should stay in touch. We may be able to narrow our differences, find some common ground, and at a minimum, make sure there are no surprises. But what's most important, we have to keep our eyes on the prize. What we're here for is to reduce the emissions that are endangering our health and our climate. There are too many agencies that are more focused on just going along, keeping their heads down, avoiding controversy, avoiding angering anybody that has influence. And I think at this agency, you stay focused on the mission. And we as regulators and advocates need to remember the people whose health is endangered by the air and climate crises. The kid who has to stay inside because of asthma, the senior citizen who is suffering from lung disease because of the air pollution, the residents who are displaced by wildfires that have been racking our state and other parts of North America. They're the reasons why this work is so important. And you know, when Professor Haagen Smit determined what was the cause of smog, and it was mainly coming from the burning of fossil fuels, the oil lobby went after him the same way that right now they're going after the Air Resources Board. They funded bogus studies. They called his findings, quote, folklore. And his response was, they said my work wasn't scientific, but you can't beat the truth. And I hope that we're in a world where that's still true. I'm inspired by one of my heroes, the great John Lewis, who encouraged all of us to make trouble, make good trouble, necessary trouble. And that's been in my role in life, has been to be one of those troublemakers. And so I plan to be around for a while longer, making that good trouble. And I want to thank all of you who are here or watching online. And thanks so much to the board for this great honor.
And thank you. Are there any comments or questions? Okay. I'm not seeing any.
And I just want to thank all of you for doing the great work and, getting this award. And earlier I came up, but, you moved forward. So I just want to thank Prasad for his great work. And I know if my dad was in the US, he's in India, he would not miss this meeting. So I came. And congratulations to all of you and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. McGovern. I'm next honored to introduce Dr. Jonathan Sammet. He is being recognized with a 2022 Haagen Smit Award in the category of environmental health research. Dr. Sammet is both a dean and a professor at the Colorado School of Public Health. His scientific contributions include a landmark series of papers on particulate matter and ozone, many of which were influential in the development of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. He has also led many influential committees, including the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, the Natural Research Council's Committee on Research Priorities for Airborne Particulate Matter, and the Working Group for Air Pollution of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Dr. Sammet is currently in Hiroshima at a meeting of the Board of the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, and he has sent this pre-recorded talk. It looks like we might be having a technical issue. So
to Haagen Smit Clean Air Award. And not surprisingly, I'm focusing on cleaning the air and how over the decades we have made progress. I'm pleased to receive an award that so many friends and colleagues whom I've worked with over the years have also been the recipients. My mentors are here early in my career, and I'll point out that Ben Ferris, probably the first respiratory epidemiologist in the country, Frank Spicer, my good friend who was Ben's mentee. Together, they started the Harvard Six Cities study. Now, Haagen-Smit, of course, is renowned for working out what was generating the smog of Los Angeles, the production of ozone. And of course, there's this infamous first episode, followed by innumerable episodes of photochemical pollution in Los Angeles. Interestingly, as told in the book Smogtown, Haagen-Smith's early work was criticized by the petroleum industry, who tried, in a sense, to discredit the work, as has happened so often since with the intellectual foundations of the work on air pollution that backs up air pollution control. So why is breathing so risky? So let's take a look at the lung, an incredibly delicate structure with defense systems built in. Air pollution, tobacco smoke, other things that we inhale, if inhaled in large enough quantities or if toxic enough, can overwhelm the lungs' defenses and cause injury. It might be acute, for example, exacerbating the status of someone with asthma, or it might be chronic, contributing to the causation of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Given that we breathe 10,000 liters of air a day, not surprisingly, we are breathing a lot of stuff into our lung, and it has the potential to damage it. So moving on, the story of damage was clear over the decades, made clear by dramatic episodes of high air pollution and high mortality, as shown here with the infamous London fog of 1952. A few years ago, I saw the Monet exhibit at the Denver Art Museum and was captivated by what he said about the London fog, which of course figured in a number of his paintings. The fogs, of course, were severe air pollution episodes like that shown in the slide, which shows the contribution of air pollution, rising smoke and sulfur dioxide, to mortality, which closely followed. And if we look at this, there are 10,000 plus extra deaths. And here we are, only 47 data points on this slide, showing so clearly how air pollution can damage health. Now, since then, there have been thousands of papers, and this slide just shows what happens if one does a very simple PubMed search, looking for papers on air pollution and epidemiology. And I've highlighted a few of them over the decades to show how some seminal papers, like the 1993 paper on mortality and air pollution in the Six Cities study, perhaps our later work bringing together many time series studies in the National Morbidity and Mortality and Air Pollution Study, or NMAPS, and then continuing on up to the most recent studies, like the Kanchak study in 2022, which shows that even our current levels of air pollution are still associated with increased risk of dying and other health events. So we are continuing to do a great deal of work. One of my early contributions to this was a time series study in Steubenville, Ohio, that I set out to carry out in the late 70s. My friend Frank Spicer had walked into my office with a box of punch cards. There's one up there on the right saying, here's data from Steubenville on hospitalizations and emergency room visits. Why don't you analyze it? Well, that turned out to be complicated because at the time there weren't agreed to methods. But I worked through that and later published this paper in 1981. You might note how high the levels of air pollution, total suspended particulates or TSP, were, ranging into the hundreds of micrograms per cubic meter in Steubenville, which had a steel mill sitting right alongside the residential area. Moving on, we then began to put together multiple time series studies. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see the time series of air pollution and mortality in one city. The job of analyzing such data becomes to tease out the signal of air pollution from all the other factors that make the rate of death go up and down, like season and like temperature. In the National Morbidity, Mortality, and Air Pollution Study, we put together results from many, many cities across the country, eventually ending up with 100 plus. And this is a model that is now widely used. This work resulted in several significant publications, including the one shown here in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000. Our team included Scott Ziegler, master statistician, and Francesca Domenici, sort of the spark plug behind a lot of this work, who has, of course, gone on to do a number of important studies using the National Medicare database, bringing together massive amounts of information to give us a good picture of air pollution and health. Now, air pollution turns out to be a very important cause of early dying, premature mortality, and morbidity. Here is the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros, several years ago, talking about the fact that there are 7 million premature deaths a year from air pollution. As shown here, those deaths come from outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution. And as we march through this slide, you'll see the contributions from those different sources of air pollution. So first we have outdoor air pollution. We move on then to household air pollution, a problem highlighted by Kirk Smith, of course. And next, finally, from ozone. And that's where we get to a total of 7 million. In other words, air pollution is a big global problem. Now, we have made improvements. And I remember one of my first trips to Denver, hate to say it, over 40 years ago, the famous brown cloud of Denver was obvious. We are not air pollution free by any means along the Front Range, where ozone is a rising problem, but we have far more days like the one shown there from 2023. Los Angeles, of course, is infamous, if you will, for its air pollution problems. I remember landing there 30 years ago, eyes burning, coughing, and feeling the consequences of ozone exposure. Before coming to Colorado, I was in LA at the University of Southern California for 9 years, and the mountains were there, and most days air quality was far better than before, although there still were those first episodes, those severe episodes. Now, if we look nationally, over time, of course, air pollution levels have decreased. Levels for our national ambient air quality standards have gone down, although ozone in particular remains a problem for the nation. Particle levels have gone down, and of course, sulfur oxide levels dropped greatly. So even in the face of a growing economy, we have managed to bring air pollution levels down. Not necessarily the case for all cities around the world. There's still much to do. With all this progress, we can ask, can we identify the benefits to health that have resulted? Well, the answer is we can. And the California Children's Health Study, initiated by the California Air Resources Board, has provided convincing evidence that there have been gains to health, as shown by the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing a benefit for the growth of children's lung function, and as shown by the paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, improvement in the health of children with asthma. One problem that we have to contend with is, of course, climate change. caused by pollution of the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. In other words, we have exceeded the capacity of the atmosphere to take on what we are dumping into it. And of course, concerns about the health consequences are an important driver for action on climate change and health. And in a number of scenarios, air pollution may be worsened by climate change from rising temperatures generating more ozone or using more fuels for cooling and heating. Going back to my title, evidence-based processes have worked. There have been challenges. I'll point out that critical to making these processes work is having the right evidence. The report, Research Priorities for Airborne Particulate Matter, reflects the work of a committee that I chaired for 6 years at the National Academies, developing and driving a strategic research agenda on particulate matter. That science fed into the kind of process that the Environmental Protection Agency uses for evaluating the evidence, determining what is new, and identifying whether there is a need to move forward with revisions of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, a process laid out on the left. So I'm pleased to have had the opportunity to contribute science and to contribute to making these processes work better. So in closing, these are the flat irons in Boulder. And in the morning, I get up and take a look at the flat irons to see what the day looks like and lies ahead. The best thing is when the air is clear, there are no clouds covering the flat irons, and I know that it'll be a day with good air quality ahead. So thank you for the opportunity to tell this story, and I'm honored to have received this award. Thank you.
And a thanks to Dr. Smit. And we will go on to our next speaker. So the next Haagen Smit awardee is Daniel Albritton, who directed the Chemical Science Division at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Sadly, Dan passed away in April of this year. He was well known for his seminal scientific work on the chemistry of the stratospheric ozone layer and other atmospheric phenomenon. He was equally well known as an outstanding science communicator, which maximized the impact of his scientific work on policy. Dan founded and chaired some of the most influential groups dedicated to air quality and climate change issues, including the working group of the 2001 report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Scientific Assessment Panel for the UN Environment Program, and the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Today, we are honored to have Susan Solomon, Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Climate Science at MIT, and a longtime collaborator of Dan's, to speak about his work. Thank you, Dr. Solomon.
Well, thank you so much. It's a very bittersweet honor to be here representing Dan. He was an icon, literally, in the field, tremendous leader, mentor to many, and remarkable interface between science and policy. So I thought a lot about what to say about Dan. I wish I had 10 hours to talk about him instead of 10 minutes, but in view of the very short time to communicate everything I'd like to, I'm going to just focus on one aspect of his remarkable career. This is just a picture of Dan. On the left there are images of the grab samplers that were flown on balloons back in the early days. You can see that's a rather younger Dan getting ready to fly those balloons and make some of the first measurements of chlorofluorocarbons in the stratosphere, which were really quite important at the time to demonstrate how much material could get up there. On the right is a picture of Dan testifying to Congress. He did so frequently. As was mentioned, he was a remarkable communicator. If I could have a click, please. The thing that strikes me is the wonderful parallels with Haagen Smit, who also spent a tremendous amount of time in the lab, as we've heard. and who was also a well-known extraordinary communicator of science. And you can see right there that he loved to be Mr. Wizard and actually make smog in front of audiences when he spoke. So the two of them had so much in common. And that's why I think Dan would have been particularly deeply honored by this award. I also know the great respect that he had for this organization, for CARB. He visited you frequently. He worked with many of you. He was a person who couldn't help but inspire confidence because he was just so incredibly smart and honest. So if I could have the next image, please. I could talk about his work on air quality. It was remarkable. I could talk about his work on climate change, which was also mentioned, equally remarkable. I mean, this guy was really the, well-rounded doer of everything that mattered in environmental science. But what I'm going to focus on are his contributions to the work on understanding and making policy regarding ozone depletion, where really I think he's very much an unsung hero that the entire planet owes so very much to. So I'm going to focus on that to the exclusion of some of the other things. And I just wanted to say a little bit about how he communicated his science. There's the famous book by Tufte on envisioning scientific information. And I'm sure many of you have seen the image of Napoleon's march to Moscow, which is sort of this classic thing about how you can communicate. Dan had his own way. And I'm sure that seeing this slide will remind many of you of the wonderful skill that he had in hand drawing his own, in those days, view graphs to describe the chemistry that he wanted to explain to people. They were remarkable images. He was really quite a very talented artist, and he used that skill to great advantage. So the top panel just shows you this is sort of a history of ozone layer science now that I'm going to give you and its interactions with policy. The ozone layer we're talking about is up in the stratosphere, very different from the tropospheric and pollution ozone that we've heard about so far today. It absorbs certain wavelengths of ultraviolet light that no other compound absorbs. So without the ozone layer, life on the planet's surface would literally be impossible. The threat that first showed up was in the 1970s when people began to realize that chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that were in widespread use in many applications, including at that time, hairspray, deodorants, oven cleaner, anything that came out of a spray can was propelled out that can by chlorofluorocarbons. They were also used, of course, in refrigeration, air conditioning, solvents. There were a wide variety of uses of them. The bad thing about them is that they don't have any way to be destroyed in the lower atmosphere. So they rise up into the stratosphere where they encounter high energy ultraviolet light, break down, make chlorine atoms. And you can see that little circle that Dan has drawn there of the catalytic cycle that leads to ozone loss. So chlorine, the atomic chlorine from the CFCs reacts immediately with ozone. That makes chlorine monoxide, which can then react with atomic oxygen and come back to being atomic chlorine again. It can go around and around and around that cycle many hundreds of thousands of times. So those chlorine and actually also bromine fragments can destroy ozone, and this thinner ozone layer can be a huge threat to life on the surface. Enhanced surface ultraviolet, we all know, will give human beings skin cancer, especially light-skinned human beings. Even if you're dark-skinned, your eyes are still sensitive to UV. And of course, impacts on the biosphere are also a matter of deep concern. So this issue first hit when people began talking about the idea that the chlorofluorocarbons might cause a few percent ozone loss in 100 years. It was a long time in the future. So it was a future problem. It was a relatively small effect we were talking about, a few percent change in ozone, but still it led to a lot of interest in this problem. So Dan asked the question, how did it progress, both the research and the policy? And if I could have the next image, that'll give you a little bit of a sense of his view of it. I just love the cartoons. I could look at them all day long. He often talked about the way that the laboratory, the field, the ballot box, and the United Nations were all intimately linked. And he was himself directly involved in bridging the science to decision makers, particularly in the area of assessments. Next image, please. Dan Albritton and his colleague, Bob Watson, really were the originators of the whole concept, I think it's fair to say, of scientific assessment that we know today. What we realize is that we don't want to be in a situation where you pit one scientist against another and they have to kind of duke it out to try to see who can talk the loudest and get the most attention. Instead of that, you really want to have a much more of a community process, and that takes real leadership. Dan and Bob were the ones who provided that and got the whole assessment process going for stratospheric ozone in the late 1980s at the bequest, really, of the policymakers. And that's what he's calling the paleo ozone era in this wonderful, once again, hand-drawn Albritton cartoon. That mechanism of international scientific assessment brought together people from all around the world to discuss, debate the literature, and try to figure out both what we know and what we don't know. And then he and Bob would act as the interfaces with the United Nations. They would go to those meetings, explain the findings that they had arrived on through a painstaking conclusion, a consensus process with typically 100 different scientists involving people from all around the world. And that held tremendous weight because those scientists were their scientists from many different countries. In later years, people from other parts of the world began to contribute, such as Gerard Maggi from France, John Pyle from the UK, Ayite Lo from Africa. There are many, many people who became involved in this, but it's fair to say that Bob and Dan invented that process. It's the same process that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Bob was really the one who kind of brought it over to that area of work, but Dan, this would not have existed without Dan. And people, I think, don't really know that out in even in our scientific community. So I just wanted to emphasize how important that was, because those assessments, there's pictures of several of them. We had a lot of fun picking out the color schemes for each book as the years went on, but you can see how they played a key role, really, leading into the choices that were made by the policy people to first freeze the production of chlorofluorocarbons and then later cut the production by 50%, then eventually phase them out in developed countries, begin to phase them out faster, and eventually add in the lower income countries. This has been a huge scientific success story. And Dan asked the question, what lies ahead now? I'll talk about that in a moment. If I could have the next image, please. One of the things that Dan often talked about was that the science policy connection and environmental issues is sort of a three-legged stool. This is obviously not a masterful Albritton, Sistine Chapel level drawing. This is just something that I got off the internet because I couldn't find one like this that he had drawn himself. He talked about the need for first credibility of the problem. Do people actually believe the problem? Then manageability. Do we think it can be managed? And finally, accountability. After a management scheme has been developed, can you substantiate that it's making a difference? It's really a very, very nice way of looking at the way these kinds of things work. And that process, not only the science, I think it's fair to say, but also technology development, the need that the industry saw to develop substitutes because there was so much public pressure necessitated by the level of science communication that was going on and the seriousness of the problem, the personal nature of the problem. You know, nobody wants to have skin cancer. So it attracted a lot of attention. It led the world to first agree to the Montreal Protocol and then phase these things out. It sent a huge technology forcing signal to industry to do things like develop ways to get spray cans, sprays out the nozzle of cans without using CFCs. And that literally involved new little nozzles that cost 15 cents more per can. So, you know, we saved the ozone layer by a variety of very, very simple measures. And many of those really trace to Dan's work on the assessments. So you can see that from having no protocol, the scenario in which the amount of chlorine in the atmosphere would have dramatically increased over the years. I hesitate to even think about what would be happening today. But certainly by 2050, the whole world would have been sitting under an ozone hole. A lack of ozone everywhere in the world by something like 50% would have been an incredible devastation for this planet. Dan Elbritton played the pivotal role in saving this planet. The years went by, the policymakers agreed to phase these things out, alternatives were found, people demanded that those alternatives be found, and that is why we were able to do this. If I could have the next image, please. Yeah, the ozone hole showed up sometime around the mid-1980s. And if we do what we are doing right now, we should probably start to see the ozone hole go away sometime around mid-century when total chlorine begins to go back to the levels that it was at in the mid-80s. So the bottom line message is that agreements like these are not made in one day or one meeting. It took many different meetings over a period, not that long really, of about 15 to 20 years to make this happen. If I could have the next image, please. Another beautiful Elbritton drawing. I think what's amazing is how prescient Dan was in the way that he thought about this problem. One of the things that he talked about was long before it had been observed that if we had a cold, long Arctic winter, that we might see ozone losses in the Arctic comparable to the Antarctic. Climatologically, that might happen in 1 in every 10 winters, but we hadn't actually seen one yet when he drew this slide. Major volcanic activity, what if that happens? How severe would the ozone losses be? Because the little particles from volcanoes can act somewhat like the polar stratospheric clouds that cause the ozone loss in the Antarctic together, of course, with the chlorine. So the presence of surfaces, I didn't have time to go into this in detail, but the presence of surfaces in the atmosphere is really, really important. And then there was to him the accountability side. If we looked even farther ahead, could we characterize the recovery and make sure that people were really doing the things they needed to be doing to eliminate these molecules? Can monitoring the amount of chlorine in the atmosphere actually show whether or not people are complying with the agreement, or maybe there's some cheating going on? He drew this slide, I think, in the late 90s. So if I can show you how prescient he was with the next image, please. What you'll see is that in 2019-2020 winter in the Arctic was phenomenal. That's the Arctic ozone when you can see how rapidly the ozone began to drop in late February, March, when the sun came back to the Arctic. It doesn't involve cold temperatures plus sunlight. So when those cold, if you please don't go ahead. When those cold Arctic winters happened, that was why this remarkable loss that drove ozone to record lows in the Arctic happened. And then came the cheating issue, which was equally dramatic and equally forecast. Next slide, please, by Dan. This is showing you the CFC-11 concentrations as a function of time as measured by the NOAA and A-gauge system of local measurements worldwide. They have both northern and southern hemisphere data. While chlorofluorocarbons were being emitted, the northern hemisphere would be a few years ahead of the southern hemisphere because that's where most of the emission was. So the southern hemisphere stuff took a couple of years to get down there and catch up. But you can see how it began to come together after, it turned over in the early 90s. That's the Montreal Protocol kicking in. And then it began to slowly drop. But then there's this weird thing where around 2013 or so, the Northern and Southern hemispheres start separating again. That has to mean somebody is cheating. Next slide. And they were. And we now know that, next slide, please, that the cheating came, it's clear from direct measurements, mostly from China. So if you look at the rate of loss in the two hemispheres, that's what the blue and the red are. And then you can look at the global rate of change. You can see that big spurt in the global rate of change, which, by the way, now has been pretty much fixed. So it's not that the Chinese government was cheating. It was presumably some industries locally that they really didn't know about. They're still learning about how to do environmental control in China. Next, please. And next. The Antarctic ozone hole is beginning its slow recovery. These are measurements of the ozone hole area, the mean area and the maximum area year by year. There are ups and downs in it, but as you can see, it has now slowly begun to recover. And the world can breathe a sigh of relief. And I think the world can also thank Daniel Lee Allwritten and thank you, CARB, for this remarkable award, which would have meant so very much to him. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Solomon. Are there any questions? All right, well, I will close out with acknowledging, oh, I apologize.
Thank you. I've been inspired by all these honorees, and I think I identify mostly with Dr. Grahava, that as a public employee working in mobile source emissions, I've had some successes and a lot of the frustrations that he described as well. But this was certainly an inspiring event and inspiring people. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I would like to take this time to just acknowledge our last winner who was unable to be here and also unable to provide a video. So Prashant Gargava was member secretary of the Central Pollution Control Board of India, and he won an award in the category of international leadership. Dr. Gargava is one of India's foremost advocates for improved air quality, and his leadership was instrumental to the justification and enactment of the 2009 National Ambient Air Quality Standards in India. And he is also steering the second version of the standards. He has worked with the World Bank's Pollution Management and Environmental Health Program on control strategies in other Asian countries. As I mentioned, Dr. Gargava was unable to attend, but we would like to thank him, even though we don't have a video or a talk. So please join me in thanking him for his work. So with that, I will conclude the awards. I would like to take the opportunity, one, to thank everybody for attending. Thank you to all of the speakers and the award winners. Like the fellow just said, I was very inspired by each and every one of you, just listening to how people have gotten here and being able to take that back and take some of the information we learned and move forward. This is very inspiring talks from each and every one of you. So thank you. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank the 4 members of the Haagen Smit Awards Advisory Committee for their efforts. And we have 3 of them in the audience right now: Alan Lloyd, Anumita Roy Chowdhury, and Judith Chow. Finn Pavley is also a member, was unable to attend, but they are in the audience and do a great job in going through lots of application and selecting these wonderful winners, which you have heard about today. I also hope that you will nominate, everybody here, nominate your Clean Air Hero for the next Haagen Smit Awards, and you can visit our website for more information. So thank you again for attending.